are ready to start. Sumala, just it's dear participants and all of you who will watch this recording. I am Federico D'Alessio, and I would like to give you a warm welcome to a new event organized by the Council for Global Cooperation. The CGC is an international non-partisan forum aimed at tackling global issues through independent research, analysis, and open dialogue. The major projects we have undertaken focus on genocide, international history and foreign policy, Cold War, and Third World studies. The main goal of this organization is to provide in-depth analysis, raise public awareness about pressing issues, examine the various crises of our era, and suggest peaceful and effective resolution. Within the CGC, I act as a research director of the Cold War project that aims to critically analyze the political, economic, and cultural legacies of the Cold War, as well as the hostilities that have emerged in its aftermath. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords, which brought the Vietnam War to an end and called for the withdrawal of foreign troops from Laos and Cambodia. And today we're truly honored to host a discussion on the book Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia by Dr. Carolyn Eisenberg. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
And
Before we start, I would like, sorry?
I have to keep remembering that you folks are at 6 o'clock at night. Is that correct?
I'm actually in Prague, so for me it's a different time zone. But yes, before we start, I would like to call the president and founder of the CGC, Sumava Basu, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico, and it is a great privilege to have you, Professor Eisenberg, to our today's book discussion for your recently published book, Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia, as Federico mentioned. And for our viewers, I am delighted to introduce our featured speaker today, Professor Carolyn Eisenberg. Professor Eisenberg is a professor of US History and American Foreign Policy at Hofstra University. Her research interests include 20th century US history and American foreign policy. Professor Eisenberg has lectured widely, publishing numerous articles on issues of war and peace. She was the consultant to the New York Historical Society for their exhibition on Vietnam, as well as to visiting historians from Vietnam interested in using American archives. She has worked with several congressional offices on foreign policy issues and is presently the legislative coordinator for Historians for Peace and Democracy. Professor Eisenberg's previous book, Drawing the Line, The American Decision to Divide Germany, was awarded the Stuart Burnett Book Prize from the Society of Historians of Foreign Relations, the Herbert Hoover Library Prize, and was a finalist for the Leonard Gelber Prize for Outstanding English Language Book on International Relations. Fire and Rain, as Federico and I mentioned a little earlier, is her second book, published in 2023 under the Oxford University Press, and has attracted wide attention for her excellent scholarship. It is our great privilege to have you today with us, Professor Eisenberg, along with our other two panelists, Professors Andrew Preston and Thomas Schwartz, whom I would introduce a little later. So without further delays, I would now like to pass on the floor to Professor Eisenberg for her opening remarks. Over to you, Professor.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this invitation and just an opportunity to engage in a more international dialogue about these issues. Now, one thing I hadn't planned to say, but it's hard not to notice, is that with the war going on in Ukraine, one of the features is that like practically every day you can pick up a newspaper, and there's a lot of reporting of the human costs of the Russian invasion. There's a real effort by by journalists to make this invasion real by looking extensively at the experience of particular people and what's happening and showing things in terms of how people's lives have been disrupted. And I keep thinking about that because although there's a kind of cliche about Vietnam, like, oh my goodness, this was our first television war and so many horrible things were being reported and that's what turned the country around. It isn't actually true. For work on my book, I spent a huge amount of time, reading through, Washington Post and the New York Times and, other mainstream outlets. And what really is more striking is how absent these kinds of stories were. And there's certain stories and photos that did attract, national attention. You see that over and over again. So you see a South Vietnamese troop soldier, shooting an enemy captive, in the head, and that was shown about 1 million times. And there's a picture of Morley Safer, going to a village and seeing, the soldiers burn down the village, and then there's a photo of the young woman on, who's been napalmed. So these are really these iconic photos, but one reason they're iconic is that on the whole, it's pretty striking how little coverage there actually was about the human side of this. And one of the things I did by way of research was actually interviewed a number of journalists for particular reasons who were there and saw particular stories. And one of the other themes that kind of emerged is the extent to which, for example, the New York Times would not print certain kinds of stories, or the extent to which a journalist, Gloria Emerson, who was there for extended periods of time, who tended to write these stories about people, specific people, and what was happening to them. Those stories would, appear on page 15. So I'm just very struck by the difference about how all of this is, is being presented. And I want to come back to that question a little bit later in terms of thinking about some of the implications of that. So I took forever to write this book. And I don't even tell people how long I was really working on it. But then people say, well, what's this book about? And I say, well, this book is about Nixon, Kissinger, and the Vietnam War. And there's often a sort of awkward silence, which doesn't necessarily dissipate when I say, and relations with Russia and China. And then with varying degrees of tact comes the follow-up question. Aren't there already a lot of books on this subject? Why is yours different? Why did you do this? So one easy answer to that question is the volume of declassified documents. We're never going to have such complete information about the policy making of any US administration again. The thousands of presidential tapes from 1971 on, and the thousands of transcripts of Henry Kissinger's telephone calls are really an extraordinary source. And apart from the specific features of this administration, there's much to be learned about larger patterns of US decision-making at the higher level. So it has distinctive features, but also there are broader features that are, worth considering. So in writing this book, I wanted to really illuminate certain matters which had been relatively neglected. And I'm going to briefly mention what they were and then turn to the substance of what I learned. So one thing I was very concerned about was to try to highlight the impact of policy, of US policy on actual people. What was happening on the ground in North and South Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, and how are the decisions made in Washington really affecting people's lives? I was also interested in the role of the anti-war movement, of which I was a part. Now, it's hardly news to anybody that this movement existed, but with this now vast declassified record, could we more reliably learn about how did the peace movement affect Nixon administration policy? And I would actually expand that a little bit, which is that there's the domestic peace movement. There's also an international peace movement. as well. And so I can't pretend to have done phenomenal research, but it is part of the picture that the administration has to contend with as it, goes forward with its policies. Then the question of China and the Soviet Union. Many historians and journalists at the time and later noted the irony that while brutal warfare was occurring in Southeast Asia, at the same time Nixon and Kissinger were being wined and dined in Moscow and Beijing. So was that a simple coincidence? So it's very unlikely. So how did these developments connect with each other? I'm sort of going through some of the things that, the issues that I was engaged with. And actually, when I first started the project, there weren't that many transcripts that were open, but over those years, the transcript appeared of, huge amount of coverage of the conversations that went on with the Russians, certainly Kissinger and Dobrynin, as well as the discussions that went on with the Chinese as well. So that turned out to be a kind of goldmine of information. Another concern I had was that the existing literature had focused almost entirely on Nixon and Kissinger themselves. And in some ultimate sense, they were the deciders. But they were not empowered to act alone. They were operating within a framework of large national security bureaucracies. So one of my questions is, how did their practices and decisions fit with these long-standing, powerful institutions? And I was thinking about that today as, you're getting some of these articles on Kissinger. And, I think you get the sense when you read some of this that, Henry Kissinger is just like out there doing anything that, that crosses his mind. And that's not true. Although what is true is there's an evolution within the Nixon administration in which over time, Nixon and Kissinger actually take the reins and begin to marginalize other actors. But nevertheless, I was really interested in, okay, these two people do not get to act alone. So, what's the context of their decision making? And then there's the larger question about Vietnam that all historians are going to ask for 100 years, which is, why did this flawed, costly war, tragic war, costly war, why did it go on for so many years? Right? That you could understand maybe at the beginning that John Kennedy, had sent advisors and he was mindful of the problems of that. But in actuality, why did U.S. officials pursue this enterprise for as long as they did? And in fact, this is the danger of just a moment. Sorry about that. This is really, a challenge. I don't think this debate is ever going to fully end about why did it go on and on. And I should say from the outset that none of these questions were really pulled out of a hat. They came directly from my teaching and the issues that emerged in class discussion. 25 years ago, a student in my class raised his hand and he said, I don't get it. If Richard Nixon was such a brilliant politician, why didn't he just blame his predecessor for the Vietnam mess and get out? And that student kept writing to me for the next 25 years. Are you done yet? So I blame him for everything. So in the time allotted, I want to highlight a few points. In constructing my narrative, I wanted to identify the experiences of particular people that illuminated important aspects of the war. And I wanted to give names to those people affected. For potential readers of my book, I wanted to lend reality to the consequence of policy decisions. In making that effort, to do that, and actually it was very little literature that did that. That there were books of policy and then there are, memoirs and people's experience, but having an integrated account was practically impossible to find. And in making the effort to do this, I found a partial answer to my last question, which is how did this war go on? An important feature of the situation was the extraordinary detachment of the principals from the suffering caused by their decisions. When White House emissaries went on fact-finding missions, they avoided places and sources who could clarify the damage for them. And one of the really absurd things that happens is that over time, Al Haig becomes one of the few people that Nixon and Kissinger trust. And so they send him on numerous missions to get the real story. But the fact is that when Al Haig went to South Vietnam, which he did many times, the people that he talked to were military officials, many of them, in and around Saigon. And so overarching these practices about how did they get information is something so basic it's easily ignored, which is that life in the national security bureaucracies entailed emotional disconnection. You can read through thousands of pages of government transcripts and find minimal upset or concern about costs to actual people. Privately, there may have been a lot of unexpressed feelings, but the norms of decision-making required silence. Now, there are famous exceptions to this. For example, the people on Henry Kissinger's staff who quit in protest over the invasion of Cambodia. Yet, as one of these men, Roger Morris described, quote, this is a quote from Morris, there was for staff members the pernicious problem of discussing outrageous, irrational official policies in the cool, bloodless language of cost effectiveness and manliness the culture of government seemed to demand. Not for the first or last time, a policy in Indochina that seemed to warrant screaming was too gently opposed. And just as one example of this, which I have in the book, you see one of the telecons that Kissinger calls up Defense Secretary Melvin Laird about My Lai, because My Lai had happened in 1968, but the story broke in 1969. So Kissinger calls up Laird and asks him, do we have a game plan? And because this is bad public relations. So Laird says, oh, did Kissinger have the pictures? He didn't. And then Laird asked Kissinger if he'd like to look at them. Should I? Kissinger asks. And Laird says, the pictures are pretty bad. Maybe not. So should I look at them? Kissinger wonders. And Laird says, you might as well not. They're pretty terrible. Now, I don't think that Kissinger went the route and never looked at those pictures, right? But this is happening at a time when people across the country are looking at Life magazine and they're looking at the pictures. So the fact that this is even a question, or that Kissinger is, calling to ask about a game plan after the horrific murder of hundreds of people, I think is very suggestive of what the inside dialogue, is. And, I want to make a just digression on a sort of related matter. It's not in the book. But I had a friend who was working with McGeorge Bundy when he was trying to write his memoirs about, the earlier phase under Johnson. And this person who was working with Bundy said that when Bundy looked over the record of that time period, one of the things that Bundy found astonishing was Bundy said, this is so dumb. How could I have said things like that? How could I have thought things like that? And I think part of the answer to that is that that's what goes on, because the whole way that the whole nature of conversation is of a certain character. And once you're in a certain kind of conversation, in key respects, you become kind of stupid. And one of the, just to amplify, and go back to this Nixon Kissinger example, one of the things I do allude to in the book was that there were 3 journalists, just after the Cambodia invasion happened, there were 3 journalists who decided they wanted to know what was happening in Cambodia. One of them spoke Vietnamese. And they decided to just get in a car and ride into Cambodia and see what's going on. And they are pretty quickly picked up by the North Vietnamese soldiers. And they tell the North Vietnamese soldiers that they're journalists, but the North Vietnamese soldiers don't know if that's true or they're CIA agents. So they keep these people hostage. I think it was for 60 or 90 days while they wait to find out from Hanoi if these people are who they said they were. And because the US was bombing all over the place in Cambodia, these 3 American journalists and their captors had to keep moving. And they're also moving as villagers are moving as well. So oddly, or not oddly, but these journalists all get to see what is happening on the ground in Cambodia. And when they are released, one of the things, of course, they do is that they approach government officials because, unlike almost anybody else, they had been in Cambodia for several months. Maybe people would be interested in what was happening there. No interest, no interest. And that story can be repeated over and over again about screening out the actual human consequences. So why was this a public relations problem, this whole situation, for the way that Kissinger, when he calls Laird, how he's thinking about it. And I think the major factor was the power of the anti-war movement. From day one, Nixon had clearly in mind the fate of Lyndon Johnson, who was mortally damaged by domestic dissenters. And within that context, they regarded negative news stories like My Lai as something to be discounted and to be discredited. Nevertheless, the peace movement had a profound effect on policy in ways that many activists didn't appreciate at the time. The most important effect of the peace movement was the removal of US troops from Vietnam. And Nixon had begun this process in the summer of 1969, taking out troops in increments of 30, 40, or 50,000 men at a time. And that would happen over the course of 4 years. Now, truthfully, everyone I ever knew in the peace movement said, this is a trick. He's just expanding the war. Look at the bombing, Cambodia, Vietnamization, none of that. All that's happening is you're changing the color of the corpses. Well, so there was some merit in this view, but overlooked was the fact that by the fall of 1972, the US had almost no combat troops in South Vietnam. And since both Nixon and Kissinger viewed ARVN, the South Vietnamese military, as lacking in this created a necessity for the administration to make a rapid peace agreement by that time. And I should also add that Henry Kissinger had seen that danger from the outset. And he was very opposed to the policy of troop removal, as was the US military in Saigon and Washington. But that was one line Nixon, the politician, drew. He believed that these withdrawals were absolutely essential to counteract the peace movement and convince the country that he was, in fact, ending the war. We're one step ahead of the sheriff, was a Nixon phrase. And by that, he meant Congress. Moderate groups within the peace movement had concentrated on political action, building the candidacy of George McGovern for president, and seeking to elect more anti-war people in the House and Senate. Again, if you were on the more radical side of the anti-war movement, this was seen as total wasted energy. Members of Congress keep making speeches, introducing resolutions that never pass, and on election day, George McGovern was defeated by a landslide. However, when you look at the record, this view of things was myopic. In his concession speech, McGovern had uttered words more apt than he realized. Quote, there can be no question at all that we have pushed this country in the direction of peace. And if we have shortened the Vietnam War, even by days, then every minute, every hour, every bone-crushing effort in this campaign was worth it, McGovern. Indeed, one accomplishment of the McGovern candidacy was to move the Democratic Party into an anti-war position. And this mattered in Congress, where anti-war resolutions were gathering steam. And that goes back to the issue of troop withdrawals. As grumpy as Nixon was about taking those thousands of troops out, the president knew this was a political necessity. To defeat these anti-war resolutions, he had to keep preempting the peace advocates by taking more men out. Also buried in the McGovern landslide was the fact that more anti-war candidates were elected to Congress, with the result that in the weeks following the 72 election, 3 of Nixon's strongest allies in Congress, Senators Stennis and Goldwater and House Leader Gerald Ford, paid him a visit the week after election to say that when the new Congress came into session, they would no longer have sufficient votes to pass appropriations for Vietnam unless a peace treaty was signed. Therefore, the message to Kissinger was to get this done. Regardless of the conflicts with the North and South Vietnamese, he needed to close the deal and get the troops and American prisoners out. And so he did. Kissinger will go to his grave insisting that domestic force, well, he already got to year 100, insisting that domestic is his diplomacy. And because of his habit of lying, these claims are often ignored, but they do contain an important truth, that he was not free to handle negotiations on Vietnam in a way that he would have preferred. For example, in December 1972, he wanted to extend the Christmas bombing for an additional 6 months. Nixon was politically astute enough to say no. The fallacy in Kissinger's presentation was in believing that absent anti-war pressure that the US could have won in Vietnam, but there's no reason to think it's true. We can't really say what exactly would have happened had there been no domestic pressure, had there been no anti-war movement. We can't determine, what the outcome was. But the American position in Vietnam in 1972, as it was in 1968, was really untenable, peace movement or not. Given the limitations of time, I'm not able to discuss the diplomacy with the Soviet Union and China, except to say that many of the declassified records are remarkable, along with his detailed reports by Russian Ambassador Dobrynin to his superiors in Moscow. So we now actually have those records that, Kissinger writes his report to Nixon about those conversations, and Dobrynin is writing to the folks back in Moscow. And at the time, it seemed like those documents would never see the light of day, but they did. So actually, the State Department has done a great job of putting out those records, and you can actually compare Kissinger's report of the meeting with Dobrynin's report of the meeting. When there's a difference, my intuition is that often that Dobrynin was more accurate. But anyway, we could know a lot from these new records. And what's apparent from these documents, which neither Brezhnev nor Zhou Enlai could miss, was the desperation of Nixon and Kissinger to get their help in pressuring North Vietnam to accept US terms, in burnishing Nixon's image as a man of peace. We can't emphasize that enough. To that end, you see Kissinger making concessions on arms control and Taiwan that were largely hidden at the time. What's the significance of this? From the outset, US military intervention in Southeast Asia had been justified by the need to demonstrate credibility to the communist superpowers. the Soviet Union, and China. And for millions of Americans, that was a worthy goal, and tens of thousands had sent their sons to war, believing that was the reason. And perhaps it was true at the beginning, but by 1972, it was no longer the case. You were not displaying strength to Moscow and Beijing. If anything, the opposite was true. And while news commentators may not have noticed, the administration's rhetoric about credibility had actually subtly shifted. Instead of demonstrating credibility to the communist superpowers, the relevant audience was now our allies, showing them that the US would be reliable in defending their interests. So why did this devastating project go on for 4 years? And there's no single answer to that question. A variety of factors converge, including the distinctive personalities and ideology of Nixon and Kissinger. But that only takes us up to a point. And I know that, with the 100th birthday, there's going to be a lot of controversy about Nixon, Kissinger, and a lot of emphasis on their particular personalities and ideas. But that way of thinking about it only takes us to a point about them. And honestly, I mean, this is where Tom Schwartz and I are going to end up disagreeing. I think you look at the transcripts of their conversations, and they are appalling. They are really appalling. But that's not the only reason. It's not that there are just these two villains that are responsible. So one simple point is desire to avoid a Joe Biden moment. It's just happened in Afghanistan. And of course, they didn't know that there was going to be a Joe Biden moment, but a fear that a precipitous withdrawal would have the enemy pouring into Saigon with all the domestic recriminations that would ensue. And in that sense, this enterprise was more about domestic credibility than international concerns. Another factor in this, I'm still back a little bit on Nixon and Kissinger, but I think it applies broadly, is that their indifference to human costs made them oblivious to how the suffering they were causing was undermining the effectiveness of their policies. There's a familiar dichotomy in which morality and pragmatism are counterposed as opposites from each other. But in this instance, they coincide. Not wanting to hear or credit the anguish and suffering of people nurtured a dangerous ignorance. Yet in explaining this, I'm moving forward, but I really want to stop on this, that they don't want to hear bad news. They don't want somebody to tell them, oh, in this village, these 7 kids died. They don't want to hear that. And it makes them stupid, right? Because they can't see how the suffering that they're causing is also undermining their ability to achieve their goals. At one point in the book, I do this little thing where in talking about the spring of 72 and the fighting that went on in that time, as always, they send, Al Haig to find out what the real story is, yet again. So, Haig goes out and he finds out, he listens to what the US military tells him. And that's his report. Okay, now we know everything. That's how they feel. But I counterpose that to some of the Quakers that were running a rehab clinic in Quang Ngai province. And Quakers had been there for years. And the reports they're writing home to the office in Philadelphia. And of course, just about the last thing in the world that anybody in the Nixon administration is going to pay any attention to is a bunch of Quakers, who are building, helping people who've lost their limbs. Like, what do they know? Al Haig's not going to meet with them. But actually, they know what's going on, and one of the directors of the clinic says, it's amazing. The front is taken over this place, and the Americans don't even know it. Right. So again, I can't emphasize enough that the moral failure also becomes an intellectual failure. In explaining the ongoing Vietnam War, perhaps the most important factor was the militaristic nature of the national security state. the dominance of the career military in decision-making, the ideological commitment to military supremacy, and unwillingness to accept the loss no matter the price paid by others. With regard to Vietnam, the views of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and of McPhee in Saigon weighed very heavily. As they entered office, Nixon and Kissinger did a survey of the government agencies and their attitudes toward the war. And actually, Daniel Ellsberg was the consultant to Kissinger drawing up this, this questionnaire. So while there were variations in outlook, almost nobody in those agencies advocated withdrawal or anything like it. It's certainly true that Nixon and Kissinger were outsized personality who left their personal stamp on events, but it is worth remembering that, and maybe perhaps on Kissinger's birthday, but it is worth remembering that they were operating within an institutional framework in which the killing of people, soldiers and civilians, have been normalized, including, I want to just say, go back to this question of why did I do this project that sometimes seemed it was taking eternity, and why is it even more meaningful today? For many people of my generation, the Vietnam War was a moral catastrophe, so shocking in its impact that in varying ways it reshaped the rest of our lives. And of course, hating Richard Nixon was part of that orientation. But at the time, and in decades thereafter, my conversations with students left me feeling there was too much about that experience that I didn't understand, which led me to do a fresh study on the archives and go to the archive. I really wanted to understand how this could have happened. And again, when we're talking about is really relevant, right? You can, what are the factors for Kennedy? What are the factors for Johnson, right? They're going to be somewhat different than what were the factors for Nixon and Kissinger, because Ted had already happened. There was a very powerful anti-war movement. So I really want to understand how things happened in the way they did. But trying to understand it is that this effort now in the present context is even more important in some ways. I mean, as far as I can tell, we're in an era of the great erasure when all the horrific US interventions, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Libya, Iraq, are blacked out in the demonization of Putin and Russia. But again, my point is not so much to exonerate Putin. I mean, obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an appalling development which should be recognized and opposed in some fashion. But is their behavior, what the Russians are doing, something unique, a moral outrage, unprecedented in human history? Have we been living until now in a rules-based international order suddenly shattered by Putin? Are his crimes against humanity so extraordinary that the United States cannot make efforts to encourage negotiations or to engage in diplomacy? With the resurrection of the Cold War in Europe and accelerating conflict with China, we cannot afford to confront these developments without some recognition of our own troubled history. And I'm hoping that my book can be a modest contribution to a necessary dialogue. Thank you.
Definitely, Professor Eisenberg, and thank you so much for such a stimulating lecture. You have opened up so many things to talk about. And before we go to the discussion thing, I would like to inform our participants that you can post your questions in the Zoom chat box, and we will try to cover them as time permits. But now I would like to go to our discussants in the panel. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Professor Andrew Preston. Professor Preston is a professor of American history at the University of Cambridge. He was educated at the University of Toronto, the London School of Economics, and Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge University. He previously taught at the University of Victoria and at Yale University, where he was a postdoctoral educator. He specializes in the history of American foreign relations, primarily since 1898. He is the author of Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Religion in American War and Diplomacy, which won the Charles Taylor Prize in 2013. And his other publications include the War Council, McGeorge Bundy, the NSC, and Vietnam. And also Nixon in the World, US Foreign Relations, 1969 to 1977. He was the president of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and with Beth Bailey, he is the co-editor of a book series with Cambridge University Press, Military, War, and Society in Modern American History. A warm welcome to you, Professor Preston. The floor is yours, Andrew.
Great. Thank you so much, Sumava. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me to to give me an excuse to read this wonderful book and then to share some thoughts on it. And it's a big book. It's a thick book. It has a lot to say, and so I'm going to leave out a lot of what it says, and I'm just going to focus on a few things that jumped out at me, and with the intention of stimulating discussion. So as Federico mentioned at the very beginning, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the end of US military involvement in Vietnam. As far as I can tell, that anniversary has been fairly quietly observed, especially when you compare it to other anniversaries of either the beginnings or endings of US wars. So there hasn't been a whole lot of commentary for obvious reasons. No actual peace resulted. It was complicated. There are so many moral ambiguities to it. So I can understand why people in the United States don't want to remember it, although of course it's extremely important to remember it. And that's one of the things that that the timing of Eisenberg's book does. But 2023 also marks another important anniversary in the history of US foreign policy. And that's of course the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And I mention this not just because the two wars have been endlessly compared, and there's a separate literature, a small library of books and articles explicitly comparing Iraq and Vietnam. You could say that this literature has its own historiography because it's so large. But I also mention it because in reading Carolyn Eisenberg's book, in reading Fire and Rain, in the shadow of the Iraq anniversary, and with all the commentary that it generated, unlike the ending of the Vietnam War, I couldn't set the two memories of these wars, or indeed the wars themselves, apart. I was reading about Vietnam, but I couldn't shake the thought of Iraq as I was reading through Fire and Rain. And Eisenberg's book was very helpful in this regard, to me at least. It's unusual, and it was extremely helpful in this regard, because this book is not just a work of history, of deeply researched history, but it's also, I read it as a kind of moral philosophy. And a voice of what I would call quiet outrage is present on almost every page of the book. And it's not oppressive. There are a lot of books about Henry Kissinger especially, but also Richard Nixon and also Vietnam, that also share this moral outrage that's in Fire and Rain, but it's oppressive. The moral outrage is oppressive. It's overwhelming. It's sort of, the author is constantly hitting you over the head with it. And I don't think I have to out any of the authors of recent Kissinger books for people to know who I'm probably talking about. They're good books, but still that moral outrage is overwhelming. And I didn't find it overwhelming at all in Fire and Rain. I found it actually pretty moving as I was reading through this book. And what I'd like to do is just draw out fairly briefly, draw out three general points from Fire and Rain, more think pieces to stimulate discussion, as I said, than anything else. And I've given each of these 3 points a kind of name. And the first, the name of my first point is what I am calling think before you act. Policymakers need to consider the consequences of their actions before they commit to using military force. It seems obvious, but it's almost never done. And that is painfully clear in the pages of Fire and Rain. Even the wars that have legitimacy and political support at home and around the world end up having terrible consequences, and people need to reflect on what it means to wage those wars. And I'm thinking of the first Gulf War in 1991, which did have a lot of opposition at the time, but it also had a broad base of legitimacy and support internationally and domestically. And it was a war that was won fairly quickly, and so on and so forth. And yet it had terrible consequences itself. Since the revolution in military affairs in the 1970s and 1980s, through the end of the Cold War and 9/11, war has become a first resort, not a final option for American foreign policy makers. It's become a first resort before, and it's considered before all other measures have even been tried, let alone exhausted. It's too easy to wage war. It's supposedly clean. It's supposedly surgical, but the consequences linger. And that is abundantly clear from Eisenberg's book. The second point is what I'm calling Lonesome Dove. And one of the figures that is really interesting in Fire and Rain is Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird. Now, Eisenberg is not the first to point out Laird's role and his kind of unique role in the Nixon administration of being, I mean, Dove is putting it too strongly, but certainly somebody who wanted to get the United States out of Vietnam and opposed a lot of Nixon and Kissinger's escalatory measures. He applied the brakes to much of what Nixon and Kissinger wanted to do, and he was a rare voice of influential insider dissent. And that comes across more clearly in this book than almost any other book I've read. And if this book has a hero within the administration, there are lots of heroes outside the administration, but if the book has a hero within the administration, it's Melvin Laird. But Eisenberg doesn't fully lionize Laird. He certainly comes in from some criticism, and I want to quote a passage towards the end of the book. Yet through it all, this is on page 499 if you have a copy and are following along. Yet through it all, Secretary Laird remained a consummate insider. He never went public with his objections, nor did he accurately inform Congress of his point of view. When required to speak with the press or congressional committees, he was stalwart in defense of administration policy. As an exercise in morality, it was a fateful choice. His intervention had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of American lives. Yet, given the reservoir of respect and goodwill he enjoyed on Capitol Hill, a more candid assessment of his objections might have affected decisions there. And I thought that was a fair summary of Laird's, of the situation Laird found himself in and of his own approach to ending the Vietnam War. But I think we can generalize more from that because it raises all sorts of moral, but also political and indeed historical questions. And it got me thinking about a period of American involvement in Vietnam that I know better than the Nixon-Kissinger period, and that's the JFK-LBJ period, where most of my research and publications have focused on. And in this sense, Eisenberg's depiction, or not depiction, characterization of Laird reminded me a little bit of George Ball, the consummate insider who offered an insider's dissent against policy, but didn't go public. And that's the standard critique against George Ball that's been made ever since the 1970s and 1980s, that he dissented from within, but didn't then take that dissent public. And maybe he could have had a wider or bigger impact on policy and maybe even have prevented a lot of years of war had he gone public. So in this sense, Laird reminds me of Ball, but even more, it also reminds me of another Secretary of Defense, and that's Robert S. McNamara. McNamara is similar, and a lot of the literature of the last 10 years is very emphatic on this point, and that McNamara, so we're told now by the new historiography, was a dissenter on Vietnam policy. Some books place his dissent as early as 1961, 1962, which I myself don't find persuasive, but there's a lot of research. I mean, people aren't writing this out of the blue. And certainly he became a dissenting voice in 1966, but also didn't go public. I mean, it nearly broke him. He had a nervous breakdown because of being in this position of escalating the war and being the Secretary of Defense, but also disagreeing with the war. And so Laird also reminded me a little bit of McNamara, and it got me thinking about the dilemmas of power, which I think are real dilemmas, are genuine dilemmas that policymakers a lot of times face. And I'm not sure that sometimes the answer is, sometimes I think it is as easy as you resign in protest and you go public with your dissent and therefore you have an impact. But even then, that decision, that choice isn't always very easy. So I do think these are real dilemmas of power. For George Ball, it was a belief that he could be more effective on the inside and he could shape policy better from the inside rather than going public. And if he'd resigned in protest and taken to the pages of Foreign Affairs of the Atlantic, LBJ would have discredited him and he wouldn't have had any influence on policy at all, which I think is right. McNamara kept quiet, not because he thought he'd be more effective, although that's what he said in retrospect, but I mean, that's what he said in his book in retrospect. It's also what he said often in retrospect, after In Retrospect was published. McNamara did it for reasons of loyalty. And this, I think, is a lot more morally indefensible. It was an issue that really came to the fore once again during the Trump presidency, when all sorts of veteran policymakers, foreign policymakers, took positions in the Trump administration, even though they had just said that Trump was completely inappropriate and unqualified for office, because they thought that they could have more influence on the inside. A lot of times they don't, but in almost any case that I can think of, going back to William Jennings Bryan all the way up to the Trump presidency, whenever a policymaker does resign in protest in order to affect policy, they actually lose influence rather than gaining influence. And I can't think of many instances, or maybe any instances, in which a policymaker has had more of an effect on the outside than the inside. But either way, I think it's a genuine dilemma, and I think Mel Laird was very much at the heart of this dilemma. The third and final point, what I'm calling the mysteries of our minds, deals with the notion of credibility and of fears for American national security. Eisenberg argues that all notions of credibility, or this is my reading of it, but that all notions of credibility or concerns about national security were completely bogus. That Nixon and Kissinger didn't have any fear. They didn't really believe in credibility. She calls it towards the end of the book, but this is the kind of phrase that recurs throughout the book, an ostensible motivation for preserving American credibility and so on and so forth. And I certainly agree that they had nothing to fear. And I certainly agree that it's a huge mistake politically, historically, and also morally, that they did decide on the policies that they ended up deciding on. But were they insincere? And this, it's tough because I don't want to be in the position of defending Nixon and Kissinger's Vietnam policies, because I do think that they're mostly indefensible. But it's hard to measure sincerity. And it got me thinking, your comments at the beginning of the session, before you talked about the book, about your student 25 years ago or so, who said, why didn't Nixon just get out? And the most obvious answer is, I think, probably the most persuasive answer. It's that he thought he shouldn't get out, that actually the best policy was to stay in. Now, I think that's a terrible mistake. And I know you think that's a terrible mistake, because I've just read your book and that's very, very clear. But I wasn't entirely persuaded, and I could be persuaded because I'm not a big fan of either Nixon nor Kissinger. But I wasn't entirely persuaded that they were insincere in seeing a certain type of protracted withdrawal as the way to preserve American credibility, and that they needed to do so in the Cold War. They may have been profoundly mistaken, but I do think that there was something to that. Otherwise, it really doesn't make any sense why they stuck with the war and why they had such a protracted withdrawal, given the fears that Nixon didn't want to repeat LBJ's domestic agony, and that, of course, he didn't want to ruin or weaken his own presidency. It brings me back to Iraq once again, and Mel Leffler's new book, Confronting Saddam Hussein, which I'm not sure if people have had a chance to read. Sumava, you may have already had a roundtable on it. I saw your program, and there are a lot of events, which is pretty impressive. But the book basically argues that the Bush administration on Iraq was deeply, deeply, deeply misguided and wrong in so many ways, and we should hold them to account. But that a lot of the fears that they expressed were sincerely felt, and there was a lot of guilt and shame mixed in as well. It's not to say that Leffler's right on Bush or that I'm right on Nixon and Kissinger, but I think it's a mistake to sort of too easily brush aside concerns for credibility and national security. It's a difficult question, because the more we contextualize fear, the closer we get to absolving the morally repugnant the closer we get to defending the indefensible. But I do think we need to go there. I close with mention of another milestone this year, and that's the 50th anniversary of the War Powers Resolution, which is going to be the feature of a roundtable in the journal Modern American History later on this year. So 1973 is also the year the War Powers Resolution was passed. And I think this is important to recognize as well, since we're talking about anniversaries, because it seems the condition of a militarized foreign policy and of the resort to armed force is endemic. The War Powers Resolution was designed, it was crafted in direct response to Nixon's Indochina policies to make sure that they would never happen again. It was designed to limit executive war powers into the future in perpetuity. And of course, it's barely made a dent. It has basically made, I would say, no difference. I'd like to think that the events in Fire and Rain could never happen again, but they have, and they probably will, even though anyone who reads this book should be convinced that it should never happen again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. As you mentioned, the 20th anniversary of Iraq, and it's true that US have always preferred war as its first option, and it has never learned from it. It's true, and we will definitely go more into it. And I would like to know Professor Eisenberg's opinions on Professor Preston's views. Yes, over to you.
Well, I mean, first, I'm glad that you enjoyed the book and found it useful. I think all of us who write books, in the end, you do hope it will cast some light and make some difference. I want to comment on two aspects of what Professor Preston has talked about, just very fast about McNamara, right? And, every time I teach about Vietnam, we always end up talking a lot about McNamara. And I don't know if folks have seen the book that his son wrote, right? Because Our Fathers Lied, which is kind of an anguished book, really, about his problem as a son, having this particular, father, and what that meant. But one thing that's really interesting about McNamara, and I think it's revealing of a whole psychology, which is after he leaves the government and Richard Nixon becomes president and Henry Kissinger is presiding, over the National Security Council, and Nixon himself at times, McNamara stays in touch with Kissinger. And those phone calls, he's there. And his way of interacting with Kissinger is to tell Kissinger, first of all, that he's a genius and God bless you and so forth, but also to offer to help Kissinger, which is really interesting. And, and at one point, Kissinger was having a terrible time with a lot of these Kennedy people who, now that Nixon was president, the Kennedy people, Harriman and a whole list of people are, Clark Clifford, are expressing opposition. And McNamara is saying, oh, we're all going to be at Ethel's. And maybe I can help you, Henry, with these other people. Right. So, I mean, there's a lot to be said about that. But I think it's really revealing. I don't have it in my book, but, apart from its gossip value, is what I think it reveals is his need to be an insider, right? And his conformity. And, so it's like, he talks a lot in his own book about loyalty to Johnson and so forth and so on. But he didn't need to be loyal to Kissinger or Richard Nixon. And yet there he is on the phone, how can I help you, Henry? So and I think that's really important in terms of understanding a lot of the behavior of a lot of people, right? That, and in some ways, I was mentioning how McGeorge Bundy, discussed with his collaborator, who happened to be my former student, about how he couldn't understand.
That must be Gordon Gold.
Right.
Gordon Goldstein, right?
Gordon, right? He's my former student. And Gordon was, a big fan of McGeorge Bundy, but when I had Gordon in my class, he was making the point that but Bundy was reading these documents from the 60s and looking at them and how stupid they were. And, he's like astonished, like, why would I have written such a dumb thing? But I think part of the answer is because number one, you're a conformist. Number two, you like to have power. You want to be an insider. And so you were adapting to the mores of this institution, the kind of, vocabulary that they have. So, I mean, I just wanted to put that in because I actually think it's not just gossipy. I think it does have, an impact on the deciders when they're sitting around, is the need to really fit in. I also wanted to really respond to your point about credibility, which I think is really interesting and a very big question. And one thing, so in a way, I kind of agree with you in terms of the beginning, that, if you'd ask them, either of them, why don't you just leave? I mean, it's destroyed Johnson, things aren't going well, get out, and blame Johnson for it, right? And I think what you're saying, Andrew, is right, that at the beginning, that wouldn't have seemed to either of them like a really great idea. So, and for reasons that have to do with credibility, and again, as you just saw Joe Biden really get, just raked over the coals for, weakening America, by taking troops out after 20 years. But what I do want to say is it really changes. And, and that is kind of part 2 of my book. It really changes. Because one of the things that I tried to show in the book, and it didn't feel to me like a stretch at all, is after Lamson 719, which is the operation that went on in Laos, and this was going to be the test of Vietnamization, right? And in fact, it's a disaster. And that's very significant to both of them. It's really significant for Richard Nixon, because the failure of Vietnamization in that summer is actually a sign to him that he could face exactly what Johnson faced, which is that in 72, that North Vietnamese troops are going to come marching into the South, and, things are just going to blow up, and he's going to be politically very exposed. So both of them have a kind of desperation about them after Lamson 719, except they lie to each other all the time, right? So, they say things that they think the other person wants them to say, but they are quite desperate. And they regard, first of all, the invitation to China as like this incredible, they worked on it for, I mean, it wasn't like they never thought of this before, but it's, oh my God, things are going so poorly. And now at last comes this invitation to China, which is like a big reprieve for them. And then as that next year and a half, goes forward, with Kissinger going to China and then Nixon going to China and the arrangements with the Russians and so forth, as all of those things happen, that they're first, like, they're very excited about this. And again, you could read it differently. You could say they're excited because they want to bring peace to the world, which is what they claim. But the personal excitement and enthusiasm for both of these things, initially really China, like Nixon has to be brought along on Russia, but by the time he's in Russia, he's a happy camper. So that it really switches. I mean, you have actually my favorite line in my whole book, which probably no one else thinks is a favorite, is a sentence by Al Haig, who gets more and more important as the time goes on. And at one point, Haig says to somebody or other, you know what, the Russians are going to bat for us, right? Because, I mean, what a ridiculous thing to say. And, because they have this thing that even in the last moments of the negotiations in 72, that Russia is going to really help them. And you have an absurd situation in which people, Kissinger sharing information with Russia and China, the transcripts of negotiations, he's sharing with the Berenin, but he's keeping it from the State Department. Right? I mean, that is, which is his obsession, is to keep things from the State Department. But it really reflects the fact that psychologically both of them had really traveled a great distance and really were personally inflated by these experiences. So I think as you go towards the end, and I kept thinking about this with respect to the Christmas bombing, which was totally and absolutely unnecessary. That, you know, you have that paradox that, you know, they're getting along just fine with Dobrynin, right? But meanwhile, they're, you know, they're killing people in Hanoi. And in a way, it's that contradiction. I have to say, if anything made me mad, like reading these documents, it's really that, you know, of what's happening in Laos, what's happening in Cambodia, you know, and meanwhile, Kissinger is taking Dobrynin to Disneyland, right? This is, you know, because he hear, you know, and Nixon says, oh, the Russians are really people, right? They, you know, let's invite them to, you know, to San Clemente. And then, you know, Kissinger thinks it would be really exciting for Dobrynin to meet Alfred Hitchcock, you know, and see Disney. And, you know, they're doing that and they're killing people in Laos and they're killing people in North, you know, and they're telling really the American public that, you know, we need to do this because of the communist superpower. So you're hearing my irritation. I mean, that to me, that contradiction is so outrageous. Okay, let me hear from Thomas Schwartz. But thank you for your commentary. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Professor. Now I would like to go to our second panelist, Professor Thomas Schwartz. Professor Thomas Schwartz is a distinguished professor of history, political science, and European studies at Vanderbilt University. He earned his BA from Columbia University and PhD from Harvard University. He taught at Harvard and has been teaching at Vanderbilt since 1990. He's a historian of the foreign relations of the United States with related interests in American politics and history of international relations. He was the president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, and his award-winning publications include America's Germany, John J. McCloy and the Federal Republic of Germany, Lyndon Johnson and Europe in the Shadow of Vietnam and Henry Kissinger, and American Power, a political biography. He received the Stuart Burnett Book Prize of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations and the Harry S. Truman Book Award given by the Truman Presidential Library 1992 for the book America's Germany. It is a great pleasure to have you with us, Professor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to follow Andrew Preston. I feel like I'm going to end up sort of saying some of the same things, and I want to say great minds think alike, but that's not that. I don't want necessarily to link Andrew to my comments, because some of my comments are clearly going to be something of the skunk at the dinner party. I have a very fundamental disagreements. I wrote this book, Henry Kissinger and American Power, which deals with exactly many of the same themes and issues that Carolyn, that Rusty deals with, and I took a very different position, and I'm frank about that, and I will make it clear where we differ. But first of all, as my mother used to say, if you can't say something nice, say nothing at all. Well, I want to say something nice first. This book is very impressive in terms of the scale of research. Rusty comments that it took her forever. I can sympathize. It took me forever to write my Kissinger book. It took a long time. There's a ton of material out there. I was very impressed with the scale in which she covered so many, especially the tapes and the telephone transcripts and all of the government documents. Rusty did not mention also as well that her involvement in a PBS documentary of this. We had a public broadcasting system documentary which brought some of these issues to light on the Madman thesis, in which her book played, I think, a significant role in that. So the book has had a real movement, and the scale of research that she's done in both government and anti-war movement and showing their interaction is really impressive. And I take my hat off to her in that. And I know the difficulties that brings. Here again, the second thing I want to say is that she does an excellent job at bringing out Melvin Laird's role. His role in setting the policy of Vietnamization. Melvin Laird was an exceptionally good diplomatic and bureaucratic infighter, I should say. He was someone who knew how to accomplish things, knew to use the press, knew how to use Congress. He was a politician's politician, and there's some funny stories about him all the way through, but he did set the policy of Vietnamization and ending U.S. involvement in the war. Now, I have a bit of a disagreement here about why he was doing this, because I think he was doing this in part because he was a Cold Warrior. He wanted to refocus attention on the rebuilding of the American military machine to defend against other Cold War, more significant Cold War issues. So I don't think he had a moral issue here. I would disagree on that. I don't think that was the fundamental question. And with George Ball and Robert McNamara, I think you see some similar things. George Ball wanted to stay in the administration in part because he was dealing with European issues that he thought were way more important. So policymakers make choices like that, and I don't think they always. I don't think we can necessarily put them often in terms of morality. But nevertheless, I want to compliment what Rusty does in bringing out Laird's role. Laird is an unappreciated figure of great significance in 20th century American foreign policy. The third is the third point I want to make, besides research in the Laird, is I think Rusty has done an excellent job of bringing the anti-war movement back into conversation on all of this. I emphasize the constraints that it posed in my book on Kissinger, but she has done an excellent job in showing this movement, remembering that this movement was very fragmented in many respects. It came together, but it was beset by disputes and arguments. There were all sorts of issues. It finally moved and came and managed to carry out the moratoriums in late '69, which really did prevent the Operation Duck Hook and the escalation of the Vietnam War that Nixon might have undertaken at that point. So I think she's absolutely right to say that people in the movement underestimated their impact on policy. And I think to that extent, she has made a real contribution to understanding this period and also understanding the role of popular opinion. The great theme that I tried to explore in my book is the role of domestic politics and domestic issues in shaping American foreign policy, which I don't think is a bug. I think it's absolutely central to how American foreign policy is made, that without domestic consent, it's going to fail. And that domestic credibility, as she suggests, is an absolutely central part of thinking about this, that maintaining your domestic credibility. But I don't think that's wrong. I think that's part of how foreign policy in the United States is made. And I think that's absolutely crucial. So I want to compliment her on all of those. And then take her to task, at least to make some disagreements. Rusty and I go back a long way on Germany on this. And I realize we're kind of, we're running to the time issue, so I'll try to be brief. At one point, and she suggests the question, how can leaders of a democracy conduct an extended war on behalf of a repressive, unpopular regime when the human costs are enormous and defeat seems likely? That's a very loaded question. That's a kind of when did you stop beating your wife question. It's very loaded. I wanted to ask in that sense, repressive, unpopular regime compared to whom? The North Vietnamese? A repressive, unpopular regime. I think one of the key deficiencies of the book, or at least one of its weaknesses, is its unwillingness to give serious consideration to Vietnamese agency. And by this, I mean both South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese. Lý Duan never appears in the book. You get no sense of how the North Vietnamese are deciding issues, their willingness to carry on the war, their willingness to undertake massive military offensives that often will have enormous human costs on their own people. The South Vietnamese have also only get the repressive, unpopular, that basically the image is straight out of the anti-war movement without any consideration of much more recent understandings of Vietnamese nationalism and politics that recognizes that Vietnamese nationalism wasn't just communist nationalism. It wasn't, there were other nationalists in Vietnam who did not like what the communists were doing. I was thinking as Rusty was talking about the My Lai massacre, I was wondering if they showed Kissinger photos of the Hue massacre. Remember, at the same time, the My Lai massacre was revealed, the remains of some 3,000 people killed by the communists in their taking of the city of Hue in 1969 were being excavated. And this was something that had a tremendous impact on South Vietnamese thinking about what the North Vietnamese were capable of and the communists were capable of. So I think the absence of serious consideration of some of the literature on Vietnamese nationalism, the Vietnamese agency is, I think, probably one of the central things I would point out as a problem with the book. I also think credibility is significant. I don't buy into the idea that credibility is not. I think we've seen in more recent times in the case of Obama's red line in Syria that he failed to enforce, and Biden's in Afghanistan, that credibility, the absence of credibility, can encourage aggressors. I think that had the United States withdrawn unilaterally in 1969, I think that would have been a disaster. I don't think that the policies that were followed made the most sense, and I wish in some ways we could have avoided some of them, but I don't think necessarily that credibility is something that can be dismissed. At the end of her book, she writes, lamentably, the self-serving belief that freedom and security of people around the world depended on US military might somehow survive. Well, I'd say ask Ukraine about that. You know, the United States has allowed Ukraine to prevent a Russian invasion. I think the United States has played a key role in preventing aggressors around the world. And yes, it's made a number of mistakes in that process, but it's also had a number of successes in the world. I don't buy into the idea that the American world-based order and rules is somehow something we should reject or find ourselves criticizing. I think it's there, and it's been a very important part of American foreign policy in a good sense. And I think Kissinger and Nixon, yes, they sound pretty bad on the tape sometimes, but a lot of times they're simply talking about boring foreign policy issues, and they're not making dumb jokes, ethnic remarks, or other sorts of things that you can highlight in the tapes, but they're talking about dealing with the communist world. You would not get from this book a sense of how serious, for example, the split in the communist world is, in the sense that, you know, basically the Soviet Union and China were also agents, and they were recognized. The Soviet Union was terrified of what was going on in China. They fought a border war. The United States, the Nixon administration, took advantage of the division in the communist world to, I think, advance American foreign policy in some very constructive ways, as well as the mistakes it made. The Berlin Agreement also was one that actually secured the existence of Berlin in a way that would allow the Cold War to end peacefully in 1989. I think it was a real success. It was not a concession to the Russians. The SALT agreements, though they were haphazardly done, were also, I think, important steps in this direction. And I think the Russians also had to make serious concessions there, and that's clear from some of the negotiating record. In May of 1972, the Russians chose the United States over their ally, the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese were deeply offended by this. They recognized that the willingness to deal with Nixon was something that was isolating them, and it led them to change their terms for the Paris peace agreements and to accept the continued existence of the two regimes. I also think the opening to China was a brilliant move by the Nixon administration. I argue in my book that it had domestic roots, but I think it was brilliant, and it had important consequences for the ability of American foreign policymakers. And ultimately, it was also a key contributor to the end of the Cold War and isolating the Soviet Union. Obviously, there's now a revisionist type of historiography about the China opening that will dominate for a time because of that. But I think those were fundamental achievements of the Nixon-Kissinger period, along with something that's not really considered in the book, namely the Middle East and other questions where I think they made very fundamental accomplishments. I'm not an uncritical defender of Henry Kissinger, but I don't think I disagree strongly with the idea that these were, in some sense, I think somehow immoral or criminal figures. The war criminal designation gets thrown around a lot, I think is ridiculous. But that said, I do recognize that Professor Eisenberg has produced an important contribution to historical scholarship, and I compliment her on that.
Excellent, Professor. And so now, Professor Eisenberg, would you like to comment on Professor Stewart's questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Hopefully I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
Thank you for your gracious commentary and finding fully 3 things that seemed okay. And as you ended up with this whole question of the determination of US officials to have military dominance, which was relevant back then, remains relevant now. I see that we're going to be able to argue till the end of time about that question. There's no danger of of this, of us suddenly agreeing about this. I guess I want to be really quick. I do think that the statement that I pay insufficient attention to Vietnamese agency, has some validity. But it's hard. You almost have to break it down about which pieces are missing that would be helpful. This isn't really a book that's saying, how wonderful the North Vietnamese are. I mean, in a sense, it's more about what's omitted than, some defense of what they were doing. Although I think what's also true is that my basic perception of why are all these troops, US troops in Southeast Asia, like, do they belong there at all? Right, that is color, that sensibility is really present. And I actually think, and this goes back to something Andrew was saying earlier, this book was written mostly in the aftermath of Iraq. And I think that situation actually did, to some extent, color, the way I was writing about it. Because to me, apart from the fact that the Iraq invasion was totally unnecessary, the horror of American soldiers going into that country, and these people in the Bush administration trying to tell the Iraqis, what to do and how to run their country, and of course being completely unsuccessful in all of that. That was definitely, that was a presence. And the question of, like, why are they even doing this? Like, what makes anybody think this is actually a useful thing to do? And that was, I think, also present. And I think that you're reacting to kind of an orientation that, is present in the book. But it was not my intention to make the North Vietnamese government the good guys. I mean, my basic point was, why are we there? Like, what business do we have there, and so forth. So comment on that. In terms of credibility, I don't think the book one way or another, says whether being concerned about credibility is a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think that's a complex issue. More what I'm saying in the book is that the rationale that was given to the public, that made families in Iowa feel like their sons were doing something important, that with the passage of time in that Nixon administration, that the issue of credibility becomes more and more phony. And I tried to really use those transcripts, but I think when you look at them and how, not only the transcripts, but then what Kissinger talking to Dobrynin is very revealing, I think, that you do get a sense really of how unserious this was. And yes, it's true. I might have said more about the Russian-Chinese split, but it is present. I mean, it's clear that, Nixon and Kissinger are aware of it. It's as was the case at the end of the Johnson administration. And it partly underlines why very early in the Nixon administration, there was an effort, right, to reach out to China and alter relations. And that is because they thought there was a split. My point is that, whatever that initial motivation was, and even again, the big thing that Kissinger will claim for all eternity, that again, the opening to China is a brilliant stroke, that's going to really be useful in our Cold War with Russia. I think that thinking was present initially, but I think it really shifts. And I think it's very difficult to read those transcripts and not think that this is, that the claims about credibility are increasingly absurd. And part of what's there, and we don't have time to really talk about this, is actually the way that Kissinger and Nixon handle very particular issues, including the issue of Taiwan, which is relevant this minute. I mean, basically, you've got Kissinger saying to the Chinese, look, we don't really care about Taiwan very much. We can't really say what our intentions are, but we're letting you know that right, that you're China. We know you're China. They're not China. And at some point, Zhou Enlai says to Kissinger, this desire that you have for ambiguity, that you're telling us these things, but you don't want to publicly state these things, this is not wise, because it is going to create right? Not wise, because this down the road, this is going to become a very big problem. So there's this thing about we're not going to sell out an ally, we're not going to sell out our friends in South Vietnam. Meanwhile, you're basically telling, the Chinese, well, Chiang Kai-shek is past. His time is done. And similarly, I think there's ways that the specific negotiation with the Russians about SALT, bringing that agreement in. I think, in fact, if you look at the content of that, there were things that Kissinger mishandled seriously. A lot of writers say that's because, he didn't know enough and he didn't have the real background. He was careless. I don't think he was careless. I think he didn't care. I think by then he also thought the nuclear competition was kind of stupid, but I don't think he cared if the net result was that ultimately the Russians were going to have more warheads than the United States, which was the logic of what he was doing. I don't think it mattered to him. So, what I feel about credibility is I'm not taking a position on it as an abstraction. It's how I think it figured in their decisions. As for the question of US military supremacy as a goal, must be more powerful than anybody else. We're going to now argue about this for 2,000 more years. But just as regards to Ukraine, there are two ways to look at it. You could say we're playing a wonderful role in Ukraine, or you might say that if US officials from the Clinton administration onward had not taken the end of the Cold War as an opportunity to secure a strategic advantage by expanding NATO and not trying to get a new security structure in Europe, that we might not be in this situation at all. So that's a very big argument. But thank you, and I know we'll have more to disagree about.
Thank you so much, Professor. So, we are almost at the end of our session, and we will just limit to 2 questions at the moment. So, firstly, I just wanted to ask you regarding the anti-war protest, which you have detailedly mentioned in your book, and you also mentioned that you have been part of these protests. So, I understand how much it has been. You have been involved with this. It has been pictured in the book very nice, and I would also like to mention that I belong from Calcutta, and even in Calcutta, when I was I am not a kid of 20th century. I am a kid of 21st century, and I've seen that this slogan which we used to hear in the city when the Iraq and the Afghanistan invasions had taken place. Tomar Naam, Amar Naam, Vietnam. I mean, it was a solidarity for the Vietnam. So this is also one thing I wanted to share with you, the internationalization of these anti-war protests. And when it comes to US, we have seen that this is the first time I would say that in history, we have seen that the rural areas had the most protest against this Vietnam policy, against this administrations. Why is that so? I just wanted to ask you this as compared to the urban centers.
I think I'm not fully grasping your question. Could you just rephrase a little bit?
Yes, so I was saying that the anti-war protest was actually an internationalized movement across the world we have seen. But when it came to US, these protests were we have seen it was prevalent more in the not the urban centers but the rural centers mostly. Why is this difference?
That it's mostly in the urban centers, is that what you're asking, as opposed to?
No, the rural centers mostly.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually not sure I have a great answer to that question. As it applies to the American peace movement, I think I'm not catching exactly what you're at. Why is it? Why I'm not asking. I think you were asking about where the protest was located.
Yes, it is on the location. Yes. So I have read that it has been mostly affected. The protests have mostly been from the rural centers and not the urban centers in that way. So that I was asking.
I would say one thing that happens with the American peace movement is it really, it becomes the geography of it changes. So initially you have a peace movement that is, to a very substantial extent, going on the campuses. And that would be campuses across the country, although there are places like, for example, Berkeley and also Columbia University, right, where they're, very big events. I was actually at Columbia when Columbia happened. But I think part of what really changes, especially in the Nixon years, and it's a little bit what that film was talking about in the movement in the Madman, is that the protest starts to spread to very remote places, which is something that is extreme, that towns and cities and places that had never had any kind of protest, especially with the moratorium that went on in the fall of 1969. That suddenly those places are getting activated, and that actually is a very important wake-up call to the Nixon administration, that the kind of rural areas or whatever are that had been sort of quiescent, and also grown-ups. I mean, that's the other, right? I mean, it's one thing you have a peace movement of young people, but now you're suddenly getting a peace movement of older people, and in different professions or just local people, and and that's very big. So that shift starts to occur. It begins to spread out across the country. I'm not sure if that is answering your question.
Yes, Professor. I think Federico is asking. Yeah.
Yeah, just to make sure if you have time, we don't want to take too much of your time. I do have one last question.
Yeah,
yes, so first of all, thank you to all the speakers for making this happen, and it was a very insightful and interesting conversation. I have a question not specific about the book, but somewhat related. If we bring our focus on the current involvement of US in Southeast Asia and its rivalry with China, so as you mentioned before, Taiwan, Strait of Malacca, and so on, how can we compare Nixon and Kissinger's approach to diplomacy with the one of the current administration? What I mean by this is that in your book, you argue that Nixon and Kissinger made perhaps excessive concessions to China. So do you think that Biden is doing the same at the moment, especially in light of the US involvement in Ukraine that is maybe removing some attention on this region?
Well, it's a very good question. It's a very interesting question. I just want to clarify, and actually Tom has an earlier setting raises. I don't necessarily think that they made improper concessions, but my point is more that, I mean, you have to discuss some of the particulars. Would there have been a different way to begin those conversations about Taiwan, because they're just beginning, right, with Nixon, Kissinger? What about arms control? I mean, I actually think on arms control that what they did was very unwise, not so much just because of conceding to the Russians, but I'm struggling because I want to say something complicated and make it not complicated. Right, but I mean, the whole approach to arms control, I think, was really flawed. So one aspect of it was that the way that he negotiated that agreement really ensured that the Russians were going to have ultimately we're going to have superiority in land-based weapons. And that's what gave a lot of ammunition to people like Paul Nitze and Eugene Rustow and people who, became the Committee on the Present Danger later. And I just but the problem wasn't just that he did something that would have the Russians have numerical superiority, which he would have explained, he had answers for that. But also he actually approached it in a different way. He forfeited opportunities to actually talk about disarmament, right? In other words, there were other things on the table that would have really had the effect, not just of setting a cap, on who could build what, but which actually would enable people would actually move the world closer to a disarmament approach, which he really didn't do. So, I mean, I feel like that's tricky, but my general point is not that he made concessions that I approve of or don't approve of. I think it's just more relevant to see the extent to which he was going to try to conciliate both powers in that second part of the Nixon administration. And that to some degree, and I think it was a positive that he, improve relationships with those powers. I don't want to be misunderstood about that. I think it was a positive thing. But I think to some extent the methodology and how Kissinger in particular did things, and the sneakiness and the lying and the, trying to win these bureaucratic fights, it actually made those advances, especially with regard to Russia, more vulnerable going forward, which is part of why you get the rise of all those people who then, cluster around Ronald Reagan and, make a lot of trouble about that. In terms of, I know that you were asking me about the comparison to now. And I would think, well, I don't pretend to be an expert on US-Chinese relations at the present time. But I do think the fact that we're now, we've recreated the Cold War, and I don't believe it's been just created, by the Chinese or the Russians. I mean, in terms of who's at fault for what. I think the policy that the Biden administration is following is extremely dangerous. I think, to go back to the question earlier, I think, I think it would be a good thing if we had a stronger international peace movement right now. And I think it would be a good thing if the peace movement in the United States was also stronger, because I think the direction that is being taken now in terms of Russia and, in terms of China is very, very dangerous. And there's very little pressure that's pushing back, in another way. And of course, then finally, maybe this is a way to conclude, is about Vietnam, right? I mean, so you now have this situation, right, where the US is looking to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese to some extent are looking to us, right, to be a force that counteracts, to be a force that's anti-Chinese. And I mean, it is probably true that, that there was anti-Chinese feeling in Vietnam before. And one might even argue that if you went back to 1949 and, the decisions that Truman made, and it taken a more benign attitude towards Vietnam then, that a lot of the history of that region actually would have been different. But you're now in a situation where, this whole thing has been turned on its head. And and both sides are cultivating each other. I was just in an event with the U.S. Institute of Peace, which was a panel that had the Vietnamese ambassador on the one hand and John Negroponte on the other. John Negroponte, being one of the big hawks back then, thought that the peace agreement was even terrible. But now we're having this very pleasant lunch. And everybody, John Negroponte couldn't have been even happier, right, to now be cultivating the Vietnamese. Again, I think the core thing is that several million people died. I mean, that really is part of my point in my book. And 58,000 Americans for something that really made very little sense in the end, and could have, and with opportunities to really avoid the damage that was done.
Thank you so much, Professor Eisenberg, for your time and explaining us about your book. It was a great session indeed. And also thank you to the panelists for joining us today. It was lovely to have all of you. And for our viewers, I would like to request that everyone should read Professor Eisenberg's book, Fire and Rain. It's an excellent book, and it's an authoritative research on the Nixon and Kissinger's foreign policy in Southeast Asia. And yes, so Professor Eisenberg, what next project are you working on after this?
Well, I'm not going to do this again. But I'm going to be working, actually there are things in terms of contemporary situation, I feel like I would like to do much more work on what's happening right now with both Cold Wars, with the situation with Russia, situation with China. I mean, one of the things when you're writing a book forever is you get kind of tunnel vision, and you know that there's very important things going on all around you, and to some extent you're not really, you know, staying up with it. So I'm sort of enthusiastic about the idea of learning more about what's happening right now and feeling, you know, clearer about the reasons for things and the impact of things. So I'm not writing another 20-year book.
I know Professor Preston is writing a book on, I think, the Vietnam War, the Cambridge volume. If I'm not wrong.
No, that's true. I'm not writing it. I'm one of the editors in a 3-volume set, The Cambridge History of the Vietnam War. I'm editing volume 2, which is basically on the Johnson years. And it should be out. Hang Nguyen is the overall editor, and Ed Miller is editing volume 1, and Pierre Osselon is editing volume 3. And the 3 volumes each have about 27, 28 chapters. So it's a big, hefty, chunky work. And it should be out. It's done. It's now in production. So it should be out this time next year.
Yeah, this year we are having many books on Vietnam. Actually, we also had a book a few months back by Mark Silverstone, and we see many books on Vietnam and this war. Yeah.
Yeah, Mark's book is a great book, The Kennedy Withdrawal.
Kennedy Withdrawal, yes. So, Professor Schwartz, are you also writing on some new project?
Yes, but I'm moving in a slightly different direction. I'm interested in the history of intelligence. The intelligence community in the United States has recently gotten a lot of publicity, but I'm interested in intelligence sharing. Been doing some research on the 5 Eyes, which is the US, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and the development of intelligence cooperation in international affairs. I've gotten interested in intelligence questions and the manner in which intelligence influence policies, how intelligence agencies operate, the types of things they do. It's a different topic for me and a slightly more specialized, but I think it actually is of quite a bit of importance, how we know what we know, and or what we think we know. And intelligence values, of course, have gotten into a lot of our history. The Iraq War, of course, comes up in that, but I am interested in the history of this project of trying to gain information about adversaries and allies.
Yeah. So we wish everyone best for their projects, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tim. I really want to thank both Andrew and Tom for your very generous commentary, and thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rusty. It was a pleasure.
Thank you as well. I appreciated it. It was good to see all of you.